Our last speaker for today is Professor David Leatherbarrow. David Leatherbarrow is Emeritus Professor of Architecture at the University of Pennsylvania. He has lectured throughout the world and held guest professorships in the UK, Denmark, and China. Questions of how architecture appears, how architecture is perceived, and how architecture shapes topography direct his research. The most recent of Leatherbarrow's 12 books is Building Time, Architecture, Event, and Experience. In 2020, he was awarded the Topaz Medallion. It's the highest award given by the AIA and the ASCA for excellence in architectural education. David Leatherbarrow's lecture title today is Big or Small, Still in Scale, or Worlding Works. Please, David.
I trust that's visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Thank you for the kind introduction, and also for, I must say, for the first two lectures, one is reluctant to begin when so much has been said already. Maybe my talk finds a position in between the two, and then we might be able to see them together in our discussion. And also apologize for being a little bit late. I was actually giving another lecture before this one, and somebody went on and on and on with a question, and I couldn't shut him off. So to begin, big or small? I think it's possible that both can be in scale, which is what I'd like to try to explain. And start with a rather well-known character who maintains, I think as Anupama did, that when thinking scale, and particularly that of a residence, one typically refers to the human body or the human person. It seems to me from the very start, our question is a matter of relationships or of correspondences, that we begin, as Professor Benedict explained, not with one, but two. And the correspondences between them that may be metric or geometric or qualitative or figurative or perhaps material, and so on. An illustration in the book to which I just referred is the one with which I'd like to start. I think it's a beautiful and perhaps key illustration, a door for the child and another one for the parent, suggesting correspondences not only between two frames, which are tectonic and figurative elements, but I think more importantly, relationships based on commonality of a single event, plainly the experience of passage. My first thesis, tacitly assumed in all comparisons, those that are pertinent to architecture, is a typical event of some sort. A second thesis, a corollary thesis, would be that there is no discussion of scale without a comparison or intuition of relationships. If you open the dictionaries, the quotation reads as follows: scale in architecture is a measurement or ratio based on the relation of an architectural element with another, or both with their surroundings, along with being in harmony with the human body and geometry. In very general terms, scale refers to an item's size in relation to something else. The whole matter at least as I see it, and what I'll try to argue in this relatively brief talk, the whole matter is contingent on what one takes to be this something else of the relationship. It's not always and only the human body, though that has to be taken as one of the primary reference. Now, one last or two last introductory points with this image in mind. Cognate forms for the English word generally are as follows. The verb to scale means to climb, as with a ladder or a flight of stairs. The noun, a scale, could be a weighing instrument by which things are brought into balance. A frequently used term is harmony. Scale, though, is also a standard of estimation or of measurement, assuming, as I think Michael pointed out, regular intervals along the length, grouped in different ways. On this basis, I mean the standard of estimation or of measurement, one can scale a drawing, and it can be scaled up or down, increasing or decreasing, but in both cases proportionally, ratio among constituent parts. And this is known perhaps most vividly to us outside our field in music, where we say a scale is a series of tones within a range. But in all these cases, here I'm circling back to my opening point, the matter of relationships is key. Relationships that could be intervals or measures. Thus, a scale is a type of ratio, a comparison between two or more quantities of the same type. And throughout the history of our field, there has been a direct link to proportionality. A is to B as C is to D. More concretely, one's hand is to one's arm or a finger to a hand in the same ratio as the width to a height of column. But as I've said, the status of the human body is not the absolute and only referent. I have then my last preliminary thesis. Today, it might be incumbent on us to rethink the human body as the only or most relevant basis of comparison. Staying with Corbusier just a little bit longer, as you know, in Bethlehem, the Church of Nativity, this portal is sometimes called, and I think erroneously called, the door of humility. It's a spurious and late attribution, but I have to say, when I went, as this person is going through, you do feel a bit humbled. Seemingly, the lowered lintel appears to have been a response to successive and unfortunate invasions. But that aside, there is a postural or embodied sense of the space and of its measure. And it's not a sense of the space that is for me or for you, but for all of us. As for the stones themselves, and with respect to Michael's earlier comment, and I think Anu's as well, I'd like to recall Alberti here. He says, stone, it comes in three sizes: the ones you can move easily, the ones you need some help to move, and the ones nobody tries to move. The first two are what Anu was discussing. They're in scale with traditional labor practices. But as you know, in Bethlehem, there's a door within a door that is itself within another frame. I believe the first is scaled to the penitent visitor, the second, or delayed attacker. The third, though, is framed to the plaza, which is to say a civic or cultural standing for the institution. The door within the door, and the door within the door that's framed to the plaza. Triple framed, scaled to different situations, a building and a public space as much as a body. Size suited to passage, but the passage is within a place that is itself a passage. And I think the connections, but also the disjunctions between one and another prompts a sense of reorientation. I must say that when I first left the interior back into the plaza, the scale of the body compared to the scale of the plaza, there was a jarring sense and a need for reorientation. So resizing, again, something alluded to in both the earlier talks. I think it's a commonplace in all high-grade institutions. This is one of the doors, the cathedral in Siena. And again, a door within a door that is itself framed by a door panel that serves as its frame. Only the first is directly commensurate, measured in the same way as to the same sizing as the human body. The second is scaled to the interior, and the third, not only to the facade, but to the group of penitents or worshipers who would pass through on a festival day, itself that group sized by the plaza, likewise to the town. But even that panel, with its three sizes, is remade by its frame and the fan light above. And that is not one, but three that make up the width of the facade, which sets the size of the square. Scaling through reframing, body, portal, facade as a whole, then to the plaza to the town to the landscape. This is a very beautiful painting, Agostino Marcucci, Procession in the Piazza del Duomo. The boxed figure you see under the canopy is a statue of the Virgin. So out of these points, perhaps another proposition. To properly understand scale, we might, at least at the outset, decenter the human person. The key relationship may not be an individual body's physical frame, but rather the world in which that frame does its work, finds its place, or achieves fullness of sense, understanding, and to some degree also experience. What's true for doors is also true for windows. Consider this famous, very beautiful case in Venice, Cadoro. On the service side of the section, different sizes and positions for different purposes. Horizontal or vertical, smaller or larger, closer or further from the corresponding ceiling plane. Yet there's still a need to proportion the aperture to the surface that fronts the room. Hence, again, reframing or resizing. The ratio or correspondence is frame to frame, its component parts, sill, lintel, and jamb, to the field in which it finds its place, and that field, among others, that make up the entire wall. One more case in Venice, I think, is likewise instructive, not of window to window, but rather facade to facade compressed into a single surface. I'm sure you know the building, Andrea Palladio's Il Redentore, one of three churches he built in the city. Coordinated elements of one kind with another, as I said, facades within facades. Why? Well, if it was controversial at the time, but if the religious space is a longitudinal cross axis at the transept, you can see the width is measured by one facade, the portal, another, the entry that is aligned with the nave, still a third, and perhaps even the body of the building as a whole beneath the dome, yet another facade, all of them compressed into a single presentation of the full body of the building, despite or perhaps by means of the resizings. So the basic question is this: what are the key scale determining relationships in architecture? Well, long ago, as I'm sure you know, Aldo van Eyck invoked a long-standing analogy. I'll say in passing, analogy the Greek word got translated as proportion when Vitruvius adopted Cicero's language. In Cicero's rhetoric, an equivalent comparison would be between simile and metaphor. Nonetheless, apart from those notes, the very beautiful image from Aldo van Eyck, what tree is to leaf, house is to city, and then he reverses the analogy. Leaf is to tree, house to city. Scale exists when component parts of each, the big and the small, are similar in size, form, or purpose. As it happens, there are different ways that the commensurability can be achieved. Many architects, but not all, accent dimensionality, metric measure. That's not the case with Aldo van Eyck. He was interested in the analogy or proportionality being qualitative, not always and only quantitative. Can we think of scale without invoking dimension and shape? Might there be an analogy or ratio of activities or of operations? The great analogy that Van Eyck repeats, that Le Corbusier repeated, that Alberti had articulated, has its origin in remote antiquity, certainly in Plato, and perhaps roughly contemporary Protagoras with his famous man is the measure. But for Plato in the Republic, it was a matter of justice, inquiring into the justice that each of us might recognize or try to practice. And Socrates says, well, if we want to understand it as best we can, let's look at it in big letters. And if you can find a just city, you can probably presume it's because there are just individuals who are dominant actors in that city. So let's look for it written in big letters, because what is evident in what is large will also be evident in what is small, which is to say, by scale. So a figure like Francesco de Giorgio won't so much size up the body and the building and the town, but see correspondences between the public square and the stomach, the elbows and the fortification. That's a qualitative, even functional sense of correspondences between things that are ostensibly different. But to stick with Van Eyck just a little bit longer, not so much measure, but purpose. In this instance, covering. Is it modern? Obviously not. European? No, this is Africa. Maybe one can say that architectures in different places at different times take up the topic of covering, and not only of a residence where you and I could reside, but maybe for me alone, or perhaps for two of us. The covering of the hut is like the covering of the person. And the similitude, or more basically the similarity in forms, is subtended by analogy of purposes. That's another sense of scaling. I think Aldo van Eyck caught it very beautifully in this spectacular and yet modest space in the orphanage. And I think in the background is the Northern European celebration of the maypole. So scaling takes for granted an event, not only a size, and an event that is a human and cultural practice, one that is situated historically, but also, I'll try to say, geographically. Plans as mappings of scaled, which is to say, analogous events. It turns out that I too am looking a little bit at Louis Kahn. Very briefly, I know we're pressed for time, to remind you of not only the building, but maybe Kahn, Van Eyck's friend, had a comparable method, analogous forms that keep a building in scale with itself and its milieu, given the way we inhabit it. Some have said it's assimilated into its vicinity by virtue of the towers. You can see on the right, those are the dormitory, about 60 meters away. The fantastic, much studied entry is an evidence of how elements can be disaggregated, a kind of exfoliation of parts, columns, beams, walls, apertures, and introduce by that means something diagonal or antithetical to the orthogonal structuring of the campus. Here I'm standing opposite the facade, a view that's very difficult to take. And you can see this introduction of the diagonal into the orthogonal space, thanks to the way the surfaces are given greater depth, entering in and exiting from the entry porch. You see the function of this stratified horizontal and the way it opens toward the edge. I think a similar edging or movement on a diagonal beyond the proper limits of the space occurs in the offices up above, and perhaps likewise in the towers that can be seen from a distance. Let me make a point out of this, or try to. Scale determinations require discerning relationships. When a building's concerned, the key question concerns the point of reference. One element to another, yes. But also those things to what I believe is outside the project. Arrival or departure we saw at the entrance, lateral opening of a structural element, but also the diagonal through the office or research space. Those are analogous situations, large or small. Similar events bind them together, and in so doing, not only the building to itself, but the work to its vicinity. I don't have time to go through it, but what I've been talking about thus far is scale within the object. But as I said at the outset, scaling is also a process. Here's an architect designing in scale with a scale. Why? Well, painters and sculptors work one-to-one. Architects, Anu has showed us something different. But generally speaking, architecture requires the use of a scale. A 1/4 inch to a foot is what he's drawing in here, because a building is a little bit too big and pricey to do one-to-one. This is one of the most important things to teach students: how to see, think, and imagine in scale. 1/8 of an inch equals 1 foot. This has been explained already, the use of the body as a measure, not only of parts, but of distances. Israeli students shouldn't get excited here. This isn't technion, it's technikon, 1592, pacing distances, and through a triangulation, measuring heights, invoking the great theorem of Thales. If you want to know the height of the pyramid and you can't climb it, work by analogy. my height to its height, the shadow it casts and the shadow I cast allow me to achieve a ratio of measures. The same way one scales a drawing by walking off its distances. The legs of the dividers are the legs you and I might pace the place. And this goes through the last 400 years of our tradition, but anteceded that in different forms of representation, even up to the point of Auguste Perret. And now, very quickly, something closer to home, measuring, scaling a height. In many architectural drawings, the way you understand distances is by reading the stairways, because of the typicality of a simple event, walking up 9 inches, 8.5 inches, 9.5 inches, typical events, typical forms. This is Caesarea, as you know. And it's not only the step, but the seat has a typical or recurring measure. But it's not only the body and the steps and the seats that the great auditoria kept in scale. It's a place for sound, for voice, and for music. The acoustic apprehension of proportions was also at play in the design of these spaces. It's a much contested term, but if you go from Caesarea to Bet Shean, you can find something rather remarkable. The site was excavated by University of Pennsylvania, and many archaeologists now maintain that this vexed issue of sounding vessels that Vitruvius describes in his treatise, that there are in the back wall these sounding vessels which not only amplify the sound, but stabilize the harmonies. It's now the harmony of people listening, but also of what is heard. That's scaling music to the scaled architecture in scale with the human body at work in the world. So now the whole thing opens. To what do we refer in scale? The body, the building, the landscape, in fact, the heavens. They too have measure and proportionality of parts. The sun, the movements of all the stars have recurring and legible patterns. I think Michael was right to stress entities making these relationships apparent. The zodiac is a system of measures of movements. Here, the body is now in tune with, aligned with, or proportioned to the world at large, the world as large as we can imagine it. Robert Flood collapsed this analogy back into the body, but what the text refers to, and maybe you can even discern in this image, seasons, tides, diurnal cycles. To what does the building refer when we talk about its scale? My thesis is scaling is a way of worlding the work, putting it in the measures of all that transcends it. And this harmonization with the body is only part of a larger project. So as Anupama said, it's a body and a collective, and the collective's participation in the world around it that is the measure of its scale. Because we don't have time, I won't take you through how this big building was scaled. It's got some big elements, and it's on a big street, the Benjamin Franklin Parkway. And I believe Williams and Shen tried to scale that very large institution to this very large cut through the city that joined the largest inner city park in America, Fairmont Park, to the center of the town. Parkway is a hybrid condition, belongs as much to the trees and to the park as it does to the monuments. They had to relocate the Barnes Museum from the suburb to the city. What was a gallery in a garden became a garden in a gallery. 2 cuts through the pre-existing plan in the lower left. In the diagram on the mid-right, you can see allowed a break in the route through the museum, letting it breathe, a kind of garden space within the museum. That established a hybrid spatiality that I think is equivalent to a hybrid materiality. The single piano key-like element up at the top, out of size, could go on forever, resized, like the doorways, like the treads, like the steps, like the windows, resized for its involvement in the boulevard, the parkway, but also resurfaced. The geometry doesn't go away, but is remade because of the qualification of the surface. So that on the right is the window in the original building, and on the left, the way Williams and Chen resized it or scaled it to this really large room, a more or less domestic window. And if one studies the stairways through the building, I think it shows attunement to, the typical riser height, but they slow the pace when approach is required and accelerate the pace when you want to get from one level to another, as in this instance. And then lastly, a comment about the physical body of the building, which Anupama explains so beautifully. Here it's a very big building, reduced in size to the panel. And then the panel, its surfaces are cultivated in such a way that their correspondences with landscape elements are made plainly apparent, whether it's in the hammering of the marble or the texturing of the silk. It's sized to your fingers or to your hand or to your arm or to your height. And your height now is commensurate with that of the room as a whole. So I'll end with the question I started with. To what does one refer when scaling a work of architecture? Don't leave the body out, but it's not the only referent. Here's my thesis. Scaling is a way of worlding an architectural work, bringing it into agreement with landscapes above and below, towns within them, human bodies too, likewise of animals and plants, the things we tend to overlook, but when brought into dialogue with architecture, make the project not only beautiful, but intelligible. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Leatherbarrow. No way to conclude after this, but I will try.